cold air seeped into the tent, sharp as a blade, slicing through the remnants of sleep. Henry woke from his slumber the way he always did after too much booze and too little rest. His first thought, nonsensical but insistent, was about coffee. Not fresh coffee, not hot coffee, but the old dregs in the flask. That would do. It wasn't until he reached for the flask, which was buried somewhere in the mound of his discarded jacket, that he noticed the tent flap. A jagged tear ran from top to bottom, edges frayed like skin peeled back from a wound. Beyond it, the misty morning leaked into the space, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and pine. There was something else, a sweet metallic tang that tickled the back of his throat. The tent floor was sticky beneath his hand. Henry frowned and looked down. Red streaked across nylon, pooling in the folds of the fabric. It wasn't paint, nor was it ketchup from last night's sorry excuse for campfire hot dogs. He sat there for a moment, staring at the mess with an expression that could have passed for mild interest at best. The realization came slow, like syrup dripping from a spoon. Rob and Kenny were no longer in the tent. The flask found its way to his hand, almost on instinct. He unscrewed the cap and poured the dregs of yesterday's coffee into the lid, before raising it to his lips. It was stone cold, bitter as hell, and somehow exactly what he needed. He let out a "R" sound and smiled. One of life's wonderful moments, he thought. Henry sat staring at the torn flap of the tent as he sipped, the memories of the night before swimming up from the murky depths of his mind. It had been Kenny's idea, of course. Kenny, with his reckless grin and his relentless optimism, had insisted they bring a few bottles of liquor to celebrate their triumphant halfway mark on the trek. Rob had rolled his eyes, but he didn't protest when the shots had started to flow. They'd sat by the fire, the three of them taking turns passing the bottles around, telling stories from their teenage years that had been told 100 times before. The woods seemed smaller then, more intimate, tamed by firelight and alcohol, and the stories of bears stalking these parts felt like ghost tales told to spook children. The place had felt safe. Henry could still hear Kenny's voice, slurred but certain. "They won't bother us, not with all this noise. Bears are shy, man," he'd said. "Shy, sure," Henry had replied. He poured another tiny cup of cold coffee and downed it, his free hand absently tracing the seam of his jeans where they had stiffened with some unidentifiable crust. There was no panic in Henry. Instead, there was a strange sense of detachment. He stood, his knees cracking after an uncomfortable night's sleep. He then stepped out of the tent, the air outside cool and sharp. The campsite was a mess. The cooler had been overturned, its contents scattered across the floor. Footprints, his and the others, had been trampled over by something else, something big. Henry crouched by one of the prints, pressing his palm into the soft earth beside it for scale. It was almost 3 times the size of his hand, with claw marks that extended impossibly far. It had to be a bear. So why did his stomach churn with something closer to curiosity than fear? Why did the back of his neck prickle, not with dread, but with anticipation, almost excitement? Henry stood slowly, the flask heavy in his hand. He turned towards the trees, where the shadows hung thick and unmoving. He thought about Kenny's laugh, about Rob's steady voice telling them to keep it down, about the way the firelight had danced in their eyes. Henry finally slipped on his boots, the worn leather creaking as he laced them up. He was deliberate about it, unhurried, like a man easing into his morning rather than one waking up in the aftermath of something potentially horrific. After pulling his coat on around him, he stepped out into the crisp morning air, rubbing his hands together to create warmth. The woods were so quiet it almost felt staged, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the faint sigh of the wind threading through the pines. Henry unzipped and then relieved himself on the nearest tree, sighing and then shuddering as the tension drained from his bladder. His mind felt strangely clear, no static or panic or confusion, just a steady, dull thrum of thought. Capped his flask after one final sip of the coffee and leaned back against the bark, staring up at the canopy of the tree. He then examined the earth around him and caught sight of the bloody trails which cut a messy path from the torn tent into the dense undergrowth. The dark streaks ran like veins across the forest floor, interrupted by smudges where something heavy had been dragged. He squatted by the nearest streak, rubbing his fingers together where they came away tacky with drying blood. Henry had seen blood before, fights in bars, a car accident once when he'd been drunk behind the wheel and the woman he'd hit had stumbled out with a broken nose. This was different though. It was darker, and amongst it were small lumps. He stood and began following the trail. As Henry walked, he thought of Kenny and Rob, his best friends, or at least that's what they called themselves. Sure, they had history, high school, college, all the years in between, when they'd been his anchor while his own life flailed and sank. Kenny had married young, a stunning blonde who'd popped out 2 kids as easy as flipping on a light switch. Rob had made partner at a law firm before he was 30, his crisp suits and quiet arrogance a constant reminder of how far Henry hadn't come. They didn't say it, not out loud, but Henry knew what they thought of him. The guy you couldn't hold down a job, whose relationships burned out faster than a cheap light bulb. The guy who still leaned on his old friends because he didn't have much of anything else going on. The trail turned darker as he walked, and the first piece of something stopped him in his tracks. It was small, almost unrecognizable at first, a pale slither of meat clinging to bone. He crouched and nudged it with the toe of his boot. A finger? Well, I'll be damned, he said quietly. Henry stood and inhaled slowly, letting the cold air of the forest fill his lungs. Something caught the morning light, an almost translucent curve. He leaned in close enough to see the delicate folds of skin. It was an ear, lying there like somebody had just casually discarded it. His stomach churned, but still no panic came. Just a rising sense of inevitability, like he was flipping through a book and already knew how the story ended. And then he found the body. It was Kenny, or what was left of Kenny. The corpse lay sprawled against the base of a tree, arms splayed wide as though in surrender. His torso was a ruin of shredded flesh and exposed ribs. Entrails spilled out onto the ground like red spaghetti. But the head, well, that was mostly still intact. Henry approached the body and leaned in close. He stared at Kenny's face, the once lively grin now twisted into something slack and vacant. The eyes were open, glazed and empty. Well, it seems you've gotten yourself into a right old pickle, Kenny, Henry said before patting his friend on the bloodstained head. Kenny had always been the loudest, the bravest, and the one who laughed in the face of danger. But now his face was still, his eyes empty. His life had been extinguished as easily as a flame pinched between a finger and a thumb. Henry reached out, almost without thinking, and closed Kenny's eyes. The lids, stuck at first, reluctant to shut, but he managed to do it on the second try, albeit forcefully. There was something about the silence now. It was heavier, pressing down on him, filling his ears with its weight. And then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, a sound rose up, curling around him like smoke. Henry stood, his boots crunching on dead leaves, and turned towards the sound. Whatever it was waiting. Henry did not turn, he did not run. Instead, he began to walk toward it. The sound was like nothing Henry had ever heard before, not in real life. It wasn't a growl, not exactly. It was too low, too wet, a bubbling rumble that seemed to vibrate the ground beneath his boots. It came in bursts, almost like breathing, but wrong somehow, too slow, too deliberate, as if whatever was making the sound wasn't just alive but was aware of his presence. Henry stepped carefully around Kenny's body, the blood slick ground threatening to pull his boots from under him. He glanced over his shoulder at the ruined mess of his so-called friend, but only once. What was left of Kenny didn't feel like Kenny anymore. It felt like something left behind, like an old burnt-out car abandoned on the roadside. The blood trail continued past the tree, winding deeper into the forest. The smudges became more erratic, as though whatever had dragged Kenny and Rob had been struggling or at least playing with its food. Henry clenched his flask in one hand. The faint slosh of the liquid inside was somehow comforting. His other hand slid into the pocket of his coat, where his folding knife sat. He pulled it out, flicking it open with a soft metallic click. The blade was small, more of a tool than a weapon, but it was better than nothing. As he walked, the memories of last night crept back in again. He thought of the way Kenny had laughed, tequila dribbling down his chin as he told the same stupid jokes he'd always told when he was drunk. Rob had groaned, shaking his head, but even he couldn't help smiling in the end. It had been good, a rare kind of good, the kind that made Henry feel like maybe just for a moment that he wished they were still around. But the thought didn't last very long, and now they were gone. The trail led him to a small misty clearing. The first thing Henry noticed was the smell. It hit him like a physical force, sour and putrid. He gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve, but it barely helped. The clearing was littered with bones. Some were clean, stripped bare and bleach white by time, whilst others were fresh, still wrapped in the ribbons of sinew and flesh. In the center of the carnage lay Rob. Well, some of Rob. His body had been torn open in a way that made Kenny's death look almost gentle. The chest cavity was hollowed out, ribs cracked and splayed wide like the lid of some grotesque treasure chest. His legs were gone below the knees, and his face was unrecognizable, pulpy mass of blood and shattered bone. Henry didn't kneel this time. He didn't need to. This wasn't Rob anymore. It was just a collection of pieces, scattered and meaningless. "Goddamn, Rob, I bet you never thought you'd turn out like this, huh?" Henry said and let out a whistle. "Jeez, man, you look like shit. If only Janice and the girls could see you now. Not such a super dad after all. You always bragged about having 30 pounds on me, not so much now, huh? I bet you don't weigh 30 pounds in total." And with that, Henry began to laugh. The sound came again, louder, closer. Henry turned slowly, gripping the knife in one hand and the flask in the other. The trees at the edge of the clearing shifted, their shadows stretching unnaturally as something massive stepped into view. It was a brown bear, but it was huge. Its fur was dark and matted, slick with something wet that gleamed. Its eyes glowed faintly, two pinpricks of sickly red that seemed to burn through the morning mist. Henry couldn't take his eyes off the bear's mouth. The thing's jaw hung open, rows of jagged teeth glinting in the gloom. A thick, dark tongue lolled out, dripping something viscous onto the forest floor. It tilted its head, watching Henry with an intelligence that made his stomach turn. Henry didn't move. His mind told him to run, but his body refused. He was frozen, locked in place by the sheer presence of the thing in front of him. The bear stepped closer, its massive paws crunching over bones and leaves. Each step seemed to echo, too loud as if the forest itself were amplifying the sound. Henry raised the knife. It felt absurd, like he was holding an umbrella against a tidal wave. The creature stopped just a few feet away, its breath washed over him, hot and rancid, carrying the stench of rot and blood. It growled again, that same low, bubbling rumble, and then it lunged. Henry didn't think, he didn't plan, He just moved, diving to the side as the creature's jaws snapped shut where he'd been standing. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. His knife skidded out of his hand, disappearing into the underbrush. The creature turned toward him, slow and deliberate, savoring the moment. Henry scrambled to his feet, the flask still clutched in his hand. Without thinking, he hurled it at the creature's face. The flask struck the bear's snout with a hollow thunk, and for a split second it recoiled, shaking its massive head. Henry didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, his boots slipping on blood and leaves as he tore through the forest, the creature's heavy breaths echoing behind him. Henry's lungs burned as he ran, the sound of the snapping branches and the thundering steps of the bear closing in. He hurtled through the forest, branches whipping at his face, his boots slipping on damp leaves and exposed roots. A steep bank appeared out of nowhere, a sudden drop that sent him tumbling head over heels. His body bounced and rolled, rocks and brambles scraping his arms and tearing his jacket. When he finally hit the bottom, he lay still for a moment, gasping for air, ears straining for the sound of the man-eating beast, and it was still coming for him. Henry staggered to his feet, ignoring the stings and cuts and bruises. His legs felt weak, his body trembling, but adrenaline forced him to move. He sprinted back towards the camp, the faint outline of his tent barely visible through the trees. As he ran, his thoughts turned dark. Why the hell did I follow it? What kind of idiot goes chasing after a blood trail in the forest? His mind berated him with each step. Oh, they'd have laughed at you for this, called you stupid, useless Henry always making the wrong move. He burst into the clearing, heart hammering in his chest, and he scanned the mess of the campsite. The cooler lay overturned, empty cans scattered everywhere, but his rucksack was still there, slumped against a rock. Henry dove for it, unzipping the largest compartment and digging through the jumbled contents. His fingers closed around the hammer he'd packed, a small, stubby thing meant for pounding in tent stakes, not for fighting off a gigantic bear. He held it up, staring at its insignificant weight compared to the sheer bulk of the animal which was pursuing him. The thought of trying to use it was laughable. Henry crouched low, gripping the hammer with both hands as he strained to hear. The forest was quiet now, eerily so, as though the bear had stopped moving entirely. He let himself breathe for a moment, thinking maybe, just maybe, it had given up chase. He picked up his bag and slung it over his shoulder. And then, the bear stepped into the campsite, its bulk filling the space between the trees, and saliva dripped in long, thick strings from its open mouth. But something was wrong. Its steps were uneven, its breathing had become labored. Each exhale was a wet, gurgling sound. Henry froze, gripping the hammer so tightly his knuckles ached. Bear staggered forward, its bloodshot eyes locked on him. It came closer, and closer still, until it was just feet away, and then it collapsed. The enormous body hit the dirt with a dull, final thud. Henry stared, wide-eyed, at the great beast which lay before him, its sides heaving in shallow, struggling breaths. For a moment, all Henry could do was stare. Then slowly a grin spread across his face, and he began to laugh. It started in a low chuckle bubbling up from his chest, but it grew, louder and more unhinged, echoing through the clearing. He dropped the hammer and then dropped to the knees beside the dying bear. "You stupid fat son of a bitch," he said, wiping the tears of laughter from his eyes. "You shouldn't have been such a greedy bear now, should you?" The bear's breathing grew slower, its massive head slumping to the side. Henry leaned in close, his voice low and venomous. "You know, I wasn't sure it was going to work. I really wasn't. But damn if it didn't." He paused, looking down at the beast. "You ate them, didn't you, you gluttonous fuck? Rob and Kenny? Bet they didn't taste too good with all that poison running through their veins." The bear let out a long, rasping groan, its body twitching as it neared its end. "I poisoned them real good," Henry said. "Just a little something in the tequila that they never even noticed. I thought I'd let the woods take care of them, but then you showed up, and you just had to go and eat them, didn't you? And now look at you, you idiot." He laughed again, his voice sharp and cutting. "One dead bear, 2 dead sarcastic patronizing bastards, and me, and I'm walking out of here." The bear gave one last shuddering breath, and then it was still. Henry stood, brushing the dirt from his knees. He grabbed his bag and slung it once again over his shoulder, and then turned towards the trail that would lead back to the car. He laughed as he walked, the sound loud and wild in the stillness of the forest. He couldn't believe how easy it had been. The bear had been like a godsend, saved him from having to bury the bodies. He wouldn't bother telling their wives what had happened. He had plans. He was going to get away. He had money now that he'd managed to swindle from a couple of elderly folks. Their life savings added up to a very tidy sum. Maybe someone would find the bodies soon, maybe not. But now that they were dead, Henry couldn't care less either way. And again, he laughed. But his laughter stopped abruptly when the sound of a sharp click-clack came from behind. Henry froze, and slowly he turned. 3 men stood at the edge of the clearing, their faces half covered by bandanas. Their clothes were dirty, patched with mismatched fabrics. Each one of them held a rifle. Even though he couldn't make out much of what they looked like, something about them was definitely off. The tallest man of the group took a step forward, the barrel of his weapon pointed directly at Henry's face. "Drop the bag, city boy," he said, his voice calm and even, "and put your hands behind your back." Henry swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. "What do you want?" he asked. "What we want ain't none of your business," the man replied. "Your business is doing what the hell you're told." "Please," Henry said, "you don't have to hurt me." "Oh, don't you worry, we'll be nice," one of the other men said, which caused the group to laugh. "Oh my God, you're a bunch of sexual deviants, aren't you?" The tall man screwed up his face. "We're a bunch of what?" "I think he means we're gonna try and screw him," one of the other men said. The tall man began to laugh, slapping his knee as he did so. The others then joined in. Eventually they calmed, and the tall man once again eyed Henry before speaking. "Boy, we ain't those kind of men, but you will be having something shoved up your butt, and that will be the long wooden beam on which we're gonna spit roast your soft city ass. You see, we like our meat, me and the boys, and tonight the meat is gonna be real soft and real tender." And with that, the man spun the rifle around and smashed the wooden butt straight into Henry's face. Henry went dizzy for a moment, fell to his knees, and then fell back onto the ground. And everything faded to black.